It's June 8th, 793, and the quiet, windswept island of Lindisfarne, up the northeastern coast of England, is about to become the stage for a seismic shift in medieval history. Monks in their isolated monastery are tending to their prayers and manuscripts, completely unaware that a violent storm is approaching. Not by sky, but by sea. Longships slice through the waves with ease, carrying fierce Norse warriors, all armed to the teeth. The Norsemen didn't know that they were about to mark the dawn of the Viking Age with an event so shocking it would horrify all of Europe. Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island, was a highly important center of early English Christianity. Irish monks settled there, and the monastic community eventually became the center of a major saints cult in celebration of its bishop, Cuthbert. In 635, the Northumbrian king Oswald summoned an Irish monk named Aidan to be bishop of his kingdom. Oswald granted Aidan the tidal island of Lindisfarne to found his monastic village. Then Aidan and the monks established a monastery and began their new lives on the island. Years after the establishment of Lindisfarne, somewhere in the 670s, a monk named Cuthbert joined the monastery. Cuthbert later became Lindisfarne's greatest monk bishop and one of the most important saints in the Middle Ages. Cuthbert reformed the monks' religious practices to those of Rome rather than Ireland, and this change caused some resentment. So Cuthbert just decided to retire and live as a hermit on a small island off the coast of Lindisfarne. Despite this hermit lifestyle, Cuthbert was still made a bishop in 685 at the king's demand. On March 20th, 687, 2 years after bishophood, Cuthbert died and was buried inside a coffin within the main church on Lindisfarne. And after 11 years, the monks decided to open the tomb, and to their surprise, they noticed Cuthbert's body hadn't decayed at all. They argued this was due to his purity and saintliness, and they deemed his body as incorrupt. They moved his remains to a coffin shrine at ground level, and the cult of Saint Cuthbert began. Of course, miracles were soon reported at the shrine, and Lindisfarne was established as a major pilgrimage center. The monastery grew in power and profited from kings and nobles, receiving land, money, and various items as gifts. In the early 700s, the Lindisfarne Gospels were produced, containing a copy of the Gospels according to the 4 disciples, recounting the life of Jesus Christ. Since they were thriving, no one could have predicted how drastically the history of Lindisfarne would shift. About 80 years later, on June 8th, 793, the Vikings arrived in Lindisfarne. This would mark the first significant attack in Western Europe. The incident scarred the surrounding area and terrified people across the entire continent. The scholar Alcuin wrote to the king and bishop of Lindisfarne, "Pagans have desecrated God's sanctuary, shed the blood of saints around the altar, laid waste the house of our hope, and trampled the bodies of saints like dung in the streets. What assurance can the churches of Britain have if Saint Cuthbert and so great a company of saints do not defend their own?" The raid was devastating, forcing the surviving monks to move inland and eventually deciding to abandon Lindisfarne for good. After retrieving Cuthbert's coffin, of course, and the leftover treasures from Lindisfarne, the monks settled at Chester-le-Street. Way later, in 995, St. Cuthbert's relics were moved and enshrined at Durham, where they are today. Before the attack, the Vikings desperately sailed the coast looking for critical resources. Upon discovering Lindisfarne, they thanked their gods for the bounty. Taking the monks by surprise, the Vikings swiftly laid waste to the tidal island. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that the ravaging of wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter, suggesting a brutal assault. Looking back from today, the raid on Lindisfarne seems like a stereotypical Viking attack, but the success of this raid style is what terrified people and normalized these types of attacks. The Vikings at Lindisfarne first targeted the wealth of the monastery. Gold, silver, jeweled crosses, reliquaries, and other treasures were stolen by the raiders. Some monks were slain with axes or swords, while others were likely taken captive for ransom or even slavery. Though the number of casualties is unknown, we can assume the slaughter was widespread. The Vikings, likely being pagans, desecrated the church, as they had no reverence for the sacred space, and this is probably what terrified Europe the most. Finally, the raiders fled as quickly as they appeared, bringing everything they could carry. As the longships drifted into the distance, Viking clans were immortalized in medieval Europe. The raid on Lindisfarne shaped future Viking strategies, targets, and their reputation across Europe. From Lindisfarne, Vikings learned that monasteries were loaded with treasure, yet poorly defended, an easy score for any battle-hardened Víkingr. Hit-and-run tactics were soon favored by the Vikings. Sweep in by sea, plunder, and escape. Vikings exploited speed and surprise over other siege methods. The psychological impact of the raid was also severe, horrifying all of Christian Europe, causing communities to pay tribute to Vikings when demanded to. Even worse for Europe, the Vikings knew that they were feared, which prompted raiders to lean into a more terrifying image, boosting morale and intimidation tactics. Besides just innovating the raid style, Lindisfarne's success drew more Norsemen into raiding. Viking fleets formed, allowing for greater targets like London, Paris, and Hamburg. The Lindisfarne incident led to Anglo-Saxon kings, like Alfred the Great, to build fortified towns and coastal defenses to dissuade Viking attacks. However, this simply led to Vikings targeting less defended spots or negotiating tribute. In the end, Lindisfarne was more than just a one-off Viking attack. It was a proof of concept. It showed Viking leaders that Western Europe was ripe for exploitation, kickstarting a century of Viking raids. Culturally, the raids embedded the Vikings as a force to be reckoned with in history, shifting them from nomadic Norsemen into the central players in medieval history we see them as today.